Good afternoon, Professor Puar. It's an honor for me to be talking to you today. I admire your work very much. Let me introduce myself. My name is Yuri Esposito. I'm a PhD student in social sciences here in Brazil, and my research interests include post-structuralist theory, race, gender, and coloniality. I'm also a multimedia artist. I work for Crocodilo Editions on the Brazilian edition of Terrorist Assemblages, Homonacionalism in Queer Times, which was a co-edition with the publishing house of Unicamp University. So today I bring you some questions me and Lou Barzaghi worked on, and also some questions that the people from Unicamp sent to us. So the first question is, could you share about the genesis of terrorist assemblages, discussing your primary motivations for the project? Which key authors, thinkers, or movements influenced its writing and theoretical framework? Have you encountered any theoretical, political, or personal challenges during the research and writing process?
Well, first of all, I wanted to just say thanks to both you, Yuri, and Lou also for inviting me to discuss the project with you. And also just, I got this a few weeks ago and I just love the book. I think it's so beautiful. And even though I don't understand most of it, even though I can kind of guess what it means, I love everything about the design. So thank you so much for your labor and your advocacy and your interest and just all of the things that go into a translation, especially a translation of a very dense theoretical work. So I really am very happy and appreciate everything that you've done. Now the book is now 18 years old since its publication. And of course, I started writing the book right after 9/11 so there's the 9/11 context for the writing of the work. But even prior to that, I had been thinking about the convergence of nation state formations and sexuality during my dissertation work in the 90s. And I think the most important theoretical conversations that were going on at that time was very much so that transnational feminist studies was becoming a thing. And I should preface also, this is very much so about the American context, the American university context, and what we were talking about and thinking about, and also, of course, the United States. But the transnational feminist studies conversation was very much so about a critique of liberal feminism through the production of gender and sexuality through the nation state, right? And the refrain was always that the nation state is heteronormative. It needs heteronormativity, a kind of heteronormative nationalism. And then during the 90s, you also had the advent of queer theory, the rise of queer theory and queer studies. And that literature was also being challenged, I think, by a lot of queer of color theorists and scholars thinking about the intersections of queerness and race and sexuality, but always in this understanding of the queer being an outlaw to the nation. And that was very specifically the language that Jackie Alexander used in her work when she was looking at Trinidad and Tobago, that in the Constitution, that the queer was always the outlaw. And I started asking questions between these two frames, the kind of heteronormative nationalism that transnational feminists always understood to be constitutive. And then on the other hand, the other side of that, which is the queer was always outlawed from the nation state. It was always illegible. It was always something that was unwelcome, banished, banned, all of these things. And I started wondering, like, is the nation always heteronormative? Does it always need heteronormativity to constantly reproduce itself, not just in terms of social reproduction, but also in terms of ideological cohesion and production? And so here you can already see Lisa Dugan's notion of homonormativity starts making some sense to me, right? As a way in which the mandates of national belonging are not just about disciplining heterosexual bodies, but also homosexual bodies as well. And then, I think also, so those are kind of, in brief, the conversations that are shaping my thinking prior to 9/11. I'm asking, how is it that the nation is heteronormative? How is it that it might actually be not just heteronormative, but homonormative? And then 9/11, September 11th happens, and I start witnessing this kind of queer liberal embrace of the war on terror. And I remember seeing this poster of Osama bin Laden in the weeks following 9/11. And I was living in New York City at that time. So this was also kind of very personally impacting a kind of day-to-day living in those months following 9/11. But I remember seeing this poster of Osama bin Laden, and the wording on it said, "So you like skyscrapers, bitch." And then there was a skyscraper anally penetrating Osama bin Laden, right? And so I understood that poster to be a kind of representation of a kind of Orientalist perverse sexuality, and a kind of punishment happening through anal penetration, and a punishment through a kind of queer enactment of sexuality. And then on the other hand, there was all of this rhetoric around, you're either with us or against us, and a kind of gay inclusion narrative, in terms of there was a rugby player on one of the planes that went down, Mark Bingham, who was a gay rugby player, and he was white and cisgender. And so there was a lot of like kind of adulation going on. I remember also the New York Times had all of these obituaries for the people who died in the towers, and many of them were queer or gay subjects who were married. And so you kind of saw the way in which the kind of patriotic energy at that time was asking to, or was allowing this enfolding of certain kinds of LGBTQ subjects into this national rhetoric, while at the same time, using queerness to abject and orientalize and pathologize this construction of the Muslim terrorist, right? So these were the things that I was kind of noticing at the time, and led to the beginning of the project. I will say around that time too, I mean, the post 9/11 period was extremely stressful. It was actually maybe when we saw the most cohesion around US politics. There wasn't this whole antagonism between the two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. There was actual, maybe the earliest signs of, or maybe the most explicit forms of authoritarian or fascist beginnings happening at the time, where there was a complete consensus about the war on terror. It was very difficult to say anything in the way of like a queer critique of the war on terror, or even a feminist critique of the war on terror. It was not that easy. There really was consensus, and so you started kind of seeing gay pride parades with all of these flags. The kind of performance of patriotism became very, very important, and these were things that mainstream, but not only mainstream LGBTQ organizations took up, and then also that these organizations were quite willing to participate in the Orientalist pathologization of Muslim bodies, in the shoring up of the figuration of the Muslim terrorists. So those are some of the things that were going on. I will say also, maybe the last thing I'll say is that my brother died very suddenly during this time, as you know from the acknowledgments in the book, and I was kind of really confronted with the gravity of the loss of my younger brother, his loss of life and then the loss in Iraq and Afghanistan, they kind of came into direct confrontation for me during those years. And so that's where the kind of biopolitical, necropolitical interest for me starts coming in, in terms of how to think about, and this is also Butler's work on the grievability of life and whose lives are grievable and whose are not. And so all of that stuff is animating the project from the start.
Oh, thank you for your answer. So the next question is, in terrorist assemblages, you deconstruct homonationalism as a simple appropriation of LGBTQ plus rights by the state. Could you elaborate on how homonationalism operates as a technology of power, redefining inclusion and exclusion, and what consequences this redefinition has for marginalized communities? Also, how do you think its manifestations have evolved in contemporary political and social dynamics beyond the context of the War on Terror since the book's original publication in 2007? Have any global political or cultural shifts since then updated or challenged the ideas presented in your work?
Yeah, so the second part of that question is probably the most interesting part to think about. When I was writing terrorist assemblages, gay, same-sex marriage had not been federally recognized or legalized. Sodomy was still illegal in some states, so there was still a kind of drive towards a rights-based project that was happening, that was in place. And so I think homonationalism was more than just a question of the co-optation and appropriation by the state of LGBTQ identity, but it was actually a kind of collusion between the state and LGBT identified people and organizations and populations. And really, in a sense, homonationalism is a theory of racialization. Ultimately, it asks us to think about the ways in which queer identities are being used to reorganize racial hierarchies in some ways. So it's really understanding it as the alignment of LGBTQ identities, organizations, affects sentiments with the state project of the war on terror at that time, right? It was not so much, I'm always a little nervous about this idea of co-optation because I think it, or, what was the word that you used? Appropriation. I always worry about that a little bit because it sounds like there's some kind of pure queer identity that then gets used properly or used improperly or deployed improperly. But I think part of the project was really to reveal how deeply invested in these racial hierarchies, in these racist hierarchies, that LGBT people can be, and not as active racists, but as liberal formations, as a kind of liberal progressive formation with a kind of deconstructed, understanding of Orientalism or Islamophobia or racial hierarchy. And so this is also, again, it's not just a kind of thinking about the, what would you say, the, in the kind of contradictions of, say, someone who is gay and also Republican, like somebody who's voting against their best interest, or somebody who's wrongly conservative and also queer. It's actually about thinking about the ways in which these identities are produced through state violence. They're produced through the hierarchies of race. They're produced through imperial warfare. And so we can't really disentangle that production of these identities from these forms of violence, right? They are produced in the midst of violence, not necessarily intrinsically against those violences. And so in that sense, I think homonationalism for me has always been not just about the kind of a process internal to the state, but also how it gets leveraged, how the United States has been leveraging homonationalism in terms of an international order. So homonationalism being a hermeneutic that asks this question, how well do you treat your homosexuals, right? And then that question becoming or emerging as an arbiter of a measurement of the capacity for national sovereignty, for governance, self-determination. So I've never really understood homonationalism as an attribute of any one nation state or states, but the field within which the state gets recognized as a modern state, as a progressive state, as a gay-friendly state, as a tolerant state, even as all of the forms of homophobia and transphobia are proliferating endlessly within that state as well, right? So we see that the United States had used that rhetoric of of a kind of progressive modernity in relation to LGBTQ rights, in relation to the war on terror. They did that with the way that they understood the war on terror to be a feminist project, right? Liberating the women of Afghanistan. And then queer organizations kind of jumped on that too and said, we also have to liberate like the LGBTQ people of Afghanistan and Iraq, right? So that kind of understanding of the United States as the place where LGBTQ identity could be most fully realized. So that kind of imperialist formulation. I think now, so much has changed in the last 17 years, especially, and I'm speaking again from the context of the United States. And so I get this question all the time, like, what is homonationalism given in the Trump era, given that there's now an active, explicit attacks, particularly on transgender people, but also on queer and transgender and non-binary people, but then also on queer people as well in various ways. And I think this is a kind of complicated question, but I think it would be a first of all, when we ask that question that way, it ties nationalism back to an understanding of homonationalism being a state attribute, which I, again, don't think it is. But it would also be a mistake to assume that the rise of authoritarian and fascist regimes globally cannot coexist with homonationalism, right? And so we've seen that coexistence in Israel, for example, right? We've seen some of that coexistence in the Philippines, for example, where when Duterte was in power, he was generally supportive of LGBTQ rights. So these are assemblages again; they're not contradictions in some sense. So what I'm thinking about lately about this is that homonationalism, I guess, it is simultaneously contracting because we are facing, through the rise of authoritarian states, the retraction of rights, the retraction of protections, the retraction of forms of recognition and also forms of material support. But I also think it might be respatializing in some sense, the homonationalism, because again, if homonationalism is an idea that's tied to US empire and US empire is changing, then I think also we have to think about the ways in which homonationalism is being respatialized in relation to the respatialization of US empire. So the easiest thing, the most obvious thing that's happening right now is that in the United States, it's Pride Parade, it's Pride Month, right? It's June, and so it's Pride season in the United States, and all of these different Pride parades are having struggles around the question of Palestine, and so it's interesting to me to think about the fissuring around Palestine becoming another marker of homonationalism, right? So the parades that are refusing to denounce the genocide, they're allowing Zionists to march in the parade, Zionist organizations. They have not, a lot of these pride organizations have not denounced the genocide. are very much so complicit with US interests around the genocide. And then you have all these alternative pride parades happening that are anti-imperialist, that have had to divest from the displays of pride that maybe they were kind of always participating in for quite some time. So I do think that that's like a kind of new formation of homonationalism that's emerging, which is literally organized around the question of Palestine, right? And that these parades are in their refusal to denounce the genocide, yet again producing an alliance with the state, a complicity with the state that is interrogating actually is quite reflective of their own interests. It's not actually a contradiction of their queer identity. It's in line with their queer identity. I'll also say, and then maybe it would be great to hear about how you see homonationalism in the context that you're in Brazil as well. But there's still, I think, a way that homonationalism is deployed as a form of soft power in global institutions that still claim to govern over a civilized world. So the courts of justice, the ICC, the ICJ, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, these are all institutions that still claim to be committed to progressive ideals. They still have employee programs for their LGBTQ employees. They still wish everyone a happy Pride during Pride Month, so you still have a kind of space of international global governance that is holding up this fantasy of a kind of civilized homonationalism that again is increasingly fractured, and so we'll see how long that actually lasts, right? And I think I just spent quite a bit of time in South Africa, where homonationalism has been is enshrined in their constitution, right? Or I won't say homonationalism is enshrined in their constitution, but LGBTQ rights are enshrined in their post-apartheid 1994 constitution. And so there's been a lot of discussion about who benefits from those rights and who doesn't have access to those rights, and how that access is racially, it plays out in terms of a racial hierarchy, right? And so there's a kind of understanding of homonationalism as propagating a kind of white LGBTQ identities and the privileges that are bestowed upon them. So you kind of see this spatial reorganization of where homonationalism is relevant, right? And so in a place like South Africa, you might have homonationalism kind of becoming, like South Africa becoming a kind of place where homonationalism is still the state policy, right? The way in which the state understands itself, as opposed to the United States. So those are some of the examples, or some of the ways in which I'm kind of tracking homonationalism, not as something that recedes in the face of fascism, but gets reorganized in the face of fascism. But I think this would be maybe a great time to talk a little bit about what you see happening in Brazil around the questions of homonationalism as well.
Well, I think we can relate this concept in Brazil, in the context of Brazil, a lot around racial hierarchies too, because here we have the favelas, which are poor slums in big cities usually, and with the majority of people living there are Black and poor. So we have a lot of discussion around this from state agencies or the media also, talking about organized crime in these regions, and they say they articulate this question with questions around gender and LGBTQ, saying that these people are usually more LGBTQ phobic, which is a narrative, a fictional narrative that is used to demonize these people, right? So as if white people, rich people weren't LGBTQ phobic too.
Right.
And also as if there weren't per people who are LGBTQ. So we have
Right.
this fictional discourse, not only on the right political spectrum, but also on the left. There's a lot of people who consider themselves left, a lot of LGBTQ people who are white, who are middle class, who reproduces these narratives that people from the favelas or Black people are more homophobic, transphobic. And the conservative political spectrum has had a rise in Brazil in the last few years, just like in United States.
Yeah.
United States had Trump, we had Bolsonaro, but these two people only represents a movement that is very pervasive. So, and the gender theory, the gender questions are very prominent in the conservative discourses. So we have a lot of dispute on that in state level or in the media level. So it's a very turbulent thing here too.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
No, you can talk.
Well, I was just thinking that when you talk about the favelas, so and this is something that I don't pay much attention to in terrorist assemblages, but should have, or it should be paid attention to. But these are also narratives not just around race, but the intersections of race and class, right? So so that the class hierarchies are also reorganized through or resutured through homonationalist discourses, as with the racial hierarchies as well.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if Lu want to talk something about Brazil or.
I just want to comment something that, in my opinion, mostly, or from what I see, there was a lot of increasing in LGBTQ plus rights in Brazil the past decades, but also it comes with some generalized punishment. So queer people are all like eager to punish
Yes.
So in that kind of, from my perspective, I can see how it could like foment or catalyze some kind of prejudice against the rapist, some quintessential image of the rapist or the burglar that's racialized. So this it's like my protection, my safety, and this is super important. I think like how safety or security became the most prominent value of liberal democracies. So we are safer, queer people are safer but then we want police. I mean, I don't want, but claim more police, more punishment, and I think this by itself strengthen some racial hierarchies and class hierarchies that are already there. So that's where I mostly could say that liberal queers are doing state a favor by claiming more and more rights. So that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think after 9/11, we had these conversations about how participating in the war on terror and these gendered and sexualized constructions of the Muslim terrorist as pathologically gendered, as pathologically sexualized, was a kind of rite of passage to belonging, right? In the you're either with us or against us articulation around the war on terror. So it's very much so about securitizing oneself in the national project, right? Into and kind of copping to this facile notion of safety, as you mentioned as well. And I also am thinking now too about this connection between, Yuri, what you're talking about, organized crime and the terrorist, right? So the understanding of the criminal come terrorist, that's really crucial to the way in which homonationalism works, right? Which is, again, about leveraging these questions of belonging and also safety in order to induce a kind of interpolate people into these homonationalist ideologies.
Sure, I think the police and state violence that is directed to the favelas have a lot, are very related to the concept of war on drugs here in Brazil.
Yeah.
We don't have usually the concept of terrorism being utilized, but the narratives of the war on drugs are very used here. And I also think that racial hierarchies have always been related to gender hierarchies.
Yeah.
Since the modernity, at least, we have Europe and white people constructing images of Black people and African people as hypersexualized. So I think hypersexualizing in a way that is perverted, exaggerated, something like that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a kind of discourse that has been around for some centuries, and we see it reactivated, of course, with some differences in the case of the terrorists in the United States, and again with the Black people here in Brazil, but also poor people. So can we move to the next question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I like to refer now to your article, I Would Rather Be a Cyborg Than a Goddess, Intersectionality, Assemblage, and Affected Politics. Speaking on a conceptual foundation for your book, the concept of assemblage. On the article, you argue that by being a correspondence to the French concept of agenciament, something is lost in the translation, but also there's a productive potential in this gap. When we work in Brazil with English-speaking authors such as yourself or Annette Singh, we face another translation trouble with the concept of assemblage. On one hand, wanting to remit to agenciament, on the other, wanting to face assemblage by its singular potentials. Agenciament has a close correspondence in Portuguese, which is agenciamento, but assemblage doesn't. So many forms of translation can be seen in Portuguese, such as montagem, which can be translated to montage or composition, mosaico, mosaic, and arranjo, arrangement, disposition, which I think all somewhat undermine the aspects of agency and relationality expressed in agenciament. Although, depending on the discourse theory one mobilizes, I think any form of assemblage can be seen as having agency or enacting performativity. This article came out more than 10 years ago, so I was wondering how you think nowadays about the importance of this concept of assemblage. Also, how do you see the relation between your work and post-structuralist theories?
I was thinking about how the conundrum moving from English to Portuguese, and so having an adequate or interesting translation for agencement, but not having an adequate translation for assemblage is actually the opposite of what happens in Spanish, right? So in Spanish, they have an adequate translation for assemblage, but not an adequate translation for agencement. And so they went with the translation for assemblage, right? Assemblajes in the Spanish translation. And so the Portuguese translation is in some ways, maps onto the French use of agencement and the understand and kind of in the original work of Deleuze and Guattari, right, which gets translated from agencement to assemblage by Brian Masumi through the translation of the 1,000 Plateaus. I've never had a chance to actually ask Brian Masumi, like, what was the idea behind this translation. It's really interesting, this move. And I think it is obviously all translations are, if we're thinking in a Foucauldian sense, like these are kind of productive, they're productive in a sense, even if we constitute them as mistranslations or translations that are they're generative even and they're missing of something. I think the way in which it's been most problematic to think about assemblage without understanding agencement is really that assemblage is understood in these other ways that you were just talking about, like montage or composition or mosaic. And so often, I think that conceptually and philosophically and methodologically, then assemblage gets mistaken for like a collection of entities or a bunch of things that are speaking to each other in different ways, as opposed to what Deleuze and Guattari meant it to do, which was to understand entities coming into formation through their relationality. So nothing pre-exists, right? Everything is only a something because it is in relation. It is having an engagement and it is having an event in some sense, right? You can also think of assemblage as a kind of ongoing eventness that's constantly bringing things together or producing things in relation and producing them in disrelation as well. For me, when I was writing terrorist assemblages, what I was really trying to grapple with was, and I think why I turned to assemblage is I was really trying to think about the massification of bodies, right? And so what's happening in this figuration of the quote unquote Muslim terrorist, is this massification of many different kinds of identity formations, many different, so everyone is getting amalgamated into the figure of the Muslim terrorist, whether they're Sikh, for example, which was one of the main like kind of earliest instances of a kind of mistaken identity, right? And so I just thought, okay, well, if the identity can be mistaken and that leads to violence, then we're talking not about identity, but some kind of other construct, right? Some kind of other conceptual frame that understands that it's about bodies that are being constituted through skin color, through what kind of head covering they might be wearing, through the beard, through facial hair, through affects as well, right? I think one of the most important things that matters to me about assemblage theory is that it understands a kind of more than human biopolitics, right? A more than human affective relationality, a more than human, or even human action of what bodies are wearing, what bodies are fronting in terms of physical elements that don't necessarily have to be there. For example, like the beard, for example. So like so many people after 9/11 shave their beards, shave their mustaches, right? That kind of thing, right? In order to avoid being massified into this figuration. Many Sikhs contemplated not wearing turbans anymore to kind of avoid this. So these are all ways in which, for me, assemblage became a frame of thinking about, again, this kind of territorialization, deterritorialization happening in concert with each other, a refusal of the idea that identity is the only site of legibility, right? Because we see that identity actually doesn't matter, right? That we're looking at what matters is a kind of affective disturbance of fear, affective disturbance of foreignness, affective disturbance of sensing a pathological, improper sexuality or gender, right? Affective disturbance of the hijab, clothing, all of these things, and so that's one way in which I think assemblage really helped me, and also kind of puts us in conversation with the societies of control literature, puts us in conversation with the literature that's emerging at the time on affect, puts us into conversation with the literature that's emerging on new materialisms, and does not presume that the human form is finite, right? It understands, assemblage really understands the human form as constantly shedding itself or kind of stretching itself or articulating itself through affect, for example, in different ways. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, through assemblage, we have, you know, a way of thinking about how things are co-located and entangled, and to think about, in that context, identities as events, as encounters, and not as stable in some sense. So that's some of the ways in which, for me, assemblage has been important and remains important.
That's great. I think what you said, and a lot of what is said in the book, evokes in me images of the Guattari thought about how identities are, or subjectivities are also multiplicities. So when you speak about the bird or the turban, I think about how these are what he would call subjectivity components. So these things have agency, not only people.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think when you say more than human, it evokes these images too. So this links a little with the next question. I like to ask about how a political and discursive assemblage like the terrorism narratives act shaping subjects like queer and racialized people. Something I've been thinking about is how this whole process can maybe be related to the concept of state terrorism, or to say it better, the terrorism enacted by hegemonic powers that pushes people towards normalization and assimilation. Although you don't name as terrorism this side of the power relations, being a queer subject myself, I think we're always facing these forces that terrorizes us to adequate ourselves to the norms of heterosexuality, cisgenderness, and also whiteness, Eurocentrism. I think these struggles between assimilation and the affirmation of difference are such a potent matter that can articulate queer and racial issues in many contexts. So I was wondering if you can expand on that, on this question of assimilation and difference.
Yeah, it's really, this is obviously a very intense moment for those questions to surface right now in the United States when, you know, there's mass persecution of queer and trans people, immigrants, Palestinians and their allies, and Palestinian solidarity activists who are all being terrorized by the state very clearly. And they're being used as examples insofar as they are the demonstration of state terrorism is about explaining to everyone else what will happen to them if they don't conform, right? So this is, you know, the state has a monopoly on terrorist violence, and part of what it is always doing is projecting the terrorist outwards or external to the state in order to maintain that monopoly on violence that the state has, right? And I guess, you know, again, when I think about this, I think about homonationalism and state terrorism, or we can call it fascism or authoritarianism, but the ways in which the state is not using soft power to punish people at this point in time, at least not in the United States, right? So homonationalism becomes the soft power of disciplining bodies, and state terrorism is the not soft power, the overt violent power that we're seeing unleashed. And so I do think that they're, in some ways, again, they're not in contradiction to each other. They're both operating at the same time. This disciplining of and control of bodies, and then the kind of overt force that's police force and military force that's being used in the United States as well. And I guess it's such a, you know, it's a terrifying time, and that word terror is in there for a reason, right? So the state is actively producing terror in this time as well. One thing that we see is that the kind of earlier liberal formations of not in my name kind of activism are not effective, right? The activism has to be systemic. It has to be anti-systems. It has to be anti-structures. It has to be anti-state. It has to be across the board. It cannot just be about, this persecution is happening to this person. And so the person adopts a not in my name kind of activism. And the person who's not that person is like, well, that's happening to that person, right? Those kinds of disaffiliations are not going to work. And I see this the most with the misapprehension of the centrality of transgender bodies to this current the current forms of state terrorism. In other words, I think people are and on often on the left, at least in the United States, there's an understanding of this is terrible what's happening to trans people. This is terrible, right? As if this is about trans individuals and not about kind of gender binarism as a system that needs to be maintained across the board for everybody, right? And trans bodies become the bodies that are being actively, overtly, visibly punished in order to maintain that system of gender binarism. So this kind of individualization, and which is the flip side of the not in my name form of activism, is very prevalent in left discourse, as if the attack on queer and trans people is somehow derivative or epiphenomenal, or as it's like a collateral damage or a side project for the fascists. No, it's not. It's central. It's absolutely central. And so if people don't understand the centrality of queer and trans assaults on queer and trans populations and peoples, then they kind of misunderstand the stakes of fascist authoritarian regimes. These fascist authoritarian regimes, they understand the stakes, right? They understand the importance of maintaining gender binary hegemony, right? But the leftists are more inclined to relegate our struggles as identity politics, right? And that's not what this is. This isn't an identity, it's not. So I think at this time, the most thing we can keep doing is having a systemic analysis, right? Having an analysis that refuses the compartmentalization of identity or refuses the understanding that the state violence, the state terrorism is happening to certain bodies and not other bodies, right? It is happening to discipline all of us meaning non-ruling class people. And that's again why I think we've seen this in the organizing around pinkwashing, for example, in relation to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. It has moved from queer subjects saying "not in my name" to anti-imperial, anti-occupation, anti-colonial forms of like the discourse around the organizing has shifted from we will not be co-opted in our not in our name identity formation to this systemic structural analysis of resistance. So I think that's like the hopeful thing. That's the thing that we can point to that's actively changing, I think.
Great answer, very interesting. So for the next question, on the expanded edition of your book in 2017, you included the postscript homonationalism in Trump times. Now the world is facing a second term of Donald Trump's presidency with direct attacks on academic production, promoting censorship on gender theory, banning diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, threatening to cut funds, and more recently, wanting to ban international students in Harvard University. Can you comment about the challenges academic production is facing in these new Trump times? Also, you recently moved to Canada. Can you talk about your experiences working there? Do you see any differences between both countries' universities?
Well, I don't know that I've been here long enough to understand everything, but I'll say a few things about how Canada feels and produces itself. As Canada is very invested in being not America, and so there's a kind of like politics of negation always going on here, but that has its limits too. I mean, what I'll say about what's happening in the United States is that Palestine has kind of changed the university forever, right? It's really forced an outing of how conservative universities actually have been all along, right? So this idea of the liberal university is kind of funny when you think about it, because in actuality, what the universities administrations are showing us now is that they were actually quite conservative to begin with. Under Biden, university administrations were leading the way, actually, in terms of performing a kind of authoritarianism through the repression of academic freedom, through the repression of student protests. And in essence, no matter who won that election, what the administrators were signaling, and eventually signaling to Trump, that they would do Trump's bidding, right? That they were willing to kind of be the front line of fascism in the United States. If Kamala had gotten arrested, they would have continued being the front line of that. And now that position is being turned against them, because as it turns out, they're not being authoritarian enough. And so they're just going to keep getting kind of caught in this loop of having to prove that they are in alignment with Trump, but it will never be enough, right? And in part, Trump's agenda is not about anti-Semitism at the university. It's not about, it's not about, crushing wokeness. It's actually just about gutting the legitimacy of higher education altogether, is what I think, right? The other interesting thing that's going on in the States too is this kind of entwinement between how Palestine is being leveraged against universities, but also DEI as well. And I wish those conversations would come together more often, because I often see the fight against dismantling DEI and the fight against a kind of eroding academic freedom and the freedom of student protest, especially around Palestine, as somehow not the same issue or not the same part of the same target. And I think that that's a real problem, and kind of represents the Palestine exception again and again. And that's why, again, I think Palestine is really changing the nature of the university, or I won't say changing, but it's really outing the university as and academics as generally quite conservative in some sense, right? So I think another interesting thing that's happening is that gender studies in general has long been under attack because of its stance on Palestine for a long time. And now they're kind of a double target because of this effort by the Trump administration to dismantle DEI as well. What I can say about Canada is just the recent elections demonstrated that Canada is becoming more conservative, and so that is a problem. And it's even in even though the Liberals won the election, that they have already begun enacting restrictive immigration policies that are mimicking U.S. policies, but under the guise of the Liberal government, right? So none of this is holding up. None of these divisions are holding up ideologically, right? The Democrats are doing the bidding of Trump. The Liberals are doing the bidding of Trump. So. I guess the big difference here is that education and healthcare are still constituted as collective social goods, and that is just a very different ideology than in the United States. So there's still a sense that university education matters, and it matters that it's public. Most of the universities in Canada are public, they're not private. And even though the healthcare system is overburdened and dealing with all sorts of pressures, and there's lots of pressures around privatization, there's still, I think, amongst people that I just kind of talk to about these issues, there's still a fundamental belief that healthcare should be free for everybody. And that's just a very different ethos, you know, and I think it will take longer for those kinds of things to deteriorate in Canada, and therefore there's more time for resistance and organizing against the deterioration. Whereas in the United States, you never had this idea that healthcare was a public good, right? It was always you know, dealt with as a commodity in a commodity market place, and the idea that education is a social good is something that people have been articulating for a long time, but has never been structurally in place in the United States in the way that it is in Canada, because of you have so much private money and private institutional, you know, private institutions dominating education in the United States. So we'll see. But this is like, you know, I'm still learning about Canada, and I don't want to play into the kinds of Canadian exceptionalisms that tend to float around about how much better this place is. There are moves to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism in the Canadian universities. There have been moves now to challenge DEI. One of the big things that happens in Canada everywhere at the universities are land acknowledgements. They're built into land acknowledgements about the Indigenous land that we're on. They're built into the system here in a way that they're not in the United States at all. And so, and when I say built into system, like we don't start any event without a land acknowledgement. We don't start, you know, a like social gathering at the university without a land acknowledgement. Everything starts with the land acknowledgement. And now people are starting to attack land acknowledgements, right? So you can see the kind of DEI / Indigenous rights and reconciliation process starting to come into view as a target. But we'll see, you know, how, yeah, we'll see.
Great. I think it's so interesting everything that you said, because there are some images that are such in contrast with what happens in Brazil. Of course, there's a lot of similarities too. Here we have public and healthcare that are public, but also a lot of private institutions too.
Mm-hmm.
But the public education, superior education is still dominant. And I found it so interesting when you said that in the United States, the universities were very willing to be complicit with Trump. And here in Brazil, the public universities, primarily, but not only, the public institutions were very resistant to the Bolsonaro's government. But of course, a lot of this resistance is what you would maybe call liberal resistance. But I think that is a big difference between what happens here and what you said happens in the United States.
Yeah, when I was in Brazil, I was at a conference, a gender studies conference, the likes of which I'd never seen anywhere else. It was so queer and trans and non-binary, and it was so unbelievably diverse, and just the kind of different bodies just everywhere. The conversations that we were having were amazing. They were so deeply political, and it felt like a very different, you know, when you go to the National Women's Studies Association meetings, it's a proper professional meeting. It was. And so this conference in Brazil was just absolutely amazing, so vibrant, energizing, all of it. The Trump administration, I don't know if they actually think that like they produce this understanding of the university as a hotbed of radicalism, and it's a misread, it's a misapprehension of what's going on at the university. So it's an interesting apprehension. Those of us who've always been askew to the university, like, or have been produced as kind of outsiders, or have had political stance on Palestine that has made us kind of outliers to the university. We understand the university as deeply conservative, right? And so in some sense, there's an opportunity for a lot of organizing to happen that is both, in alignment with radical student protesting that's happening right now. So that part is different from, like, say, the university as a conservative institution, because we can affirm the amazingness of that organizing, of student organizing. But there's also just, where is the radical work happening of challenging these structures? It's not at the university, it's other places. And so that kind of misapprehension by Trump's government of the university as this hotbed of radical, destructive, anti-state, activity, it means that it's a cover for where that's actually happening elsewhere.
Yeah, I feel like I have to say that not everything is great in university here. The universities obviously reproduce and produce a lot of social hierarchies, racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies, class hierarchies, primarily. But we have such an interesting movement with universities here in the last decades, because Lula, who is the president nowadays, was president in the past decades, and in his government, with a lot of effort from the Black movements, we had affirmative actions implemented in public universities, and this changes a lot of the landscape of the student bodies, and not that of the professor bodies, but the university has been a place of social change in Brazil. Of course, not as much as it could be, but the conservatives sense that, and they want to cut it in the bud.
Yeah.
And nowadays we have an interesting process too, that the public universities are having transgender affirmative action. A lot of universities are implementing that too, with initially on the post-graduation master's degree and PhD, but now in graduation too. So that's very interesting. It's a movement that is always complex, because we have these social structures being reproduced from the administrations, but also from the student bodies, but also a lot of rights being attained. And so can we move to the next question?
Sure.
It's also is actually the last one. So given that Terrorist Assemblages was your first book translated into Portuguese, and that Crocodilo will publish next year your second book, The Right to Maim, I'd like to know if you identify any continuities between the theoretical concerns that motivated these two works, especially with regard to the relationships between bodies, power, and state violence.
Yeah, I think that, obviously both books are about the violence of humanization, not the violence of dehumanization, but the violence of humanization. So as produced through liberal rights frameworks, as produced through human rights frameworks, as produced through humanitarian discourses. So the consequences of the violence of humanization, right? What happens when we get what we want? What happens when we get our rights? What do we do next? What happens when those rights that we get are implicated in the disenfranchisement and exclusion, expulsion, abandonment of others, right? So those are the kind of biopolitical, necropolitical questions that are animating both projects, very much so. And you know, in some ways, a very easy mapping of that transition is here's what happens when we get LGBTQ rights, and then the right to name says, well, here's what happens when we get, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or we get recognition for disabled people, or we get disability rights, and so I think both projects have an investment in, or I have been invested in understanding the kind of brutal, very brutal humanism that undergirds liberalism. And I think, so I think the two projects kind of speak to, you know, I don't think that liberalism is going anywhere, but I do think that there is a taxing on liberal ideologies, a kind of wearing down of the power of those ideologies, and understanding that liberalism is inevitably about increasing the scope of power under the guise of a civilizational discourse, or under the guise of a liberal democratic governance. So we're seeing the ways in which liberalism is it's really it's not just about okay, these liberal rights aren't accessible to everybody. It's also about the ways in which liberalism authorizes the expansion of other forms of violence. And so I think that I would say that that's, you know, I'm very interested in what kinds of cover is offered to violence. So in the right to maim, you know, I really start understanding the way that a debilitated life is set up as the antidote to killing, to death. And so the presumption is always that there has been a kind of humane approach to killing or not killing, that allows for, like, you should be thankful for your debilitated life because we could have killed you. And so that operates as a kind of alibi, as a cover for liberal violence, right? To actually expand in scope. And we're seeing that kind of unfold during the genocide on Palestinians in Gaza now, right? One thing that has really shifted, and this is something that I'm trying to account for in new writing, is again that cover that liberalism provides is not something that the Israeli state cares about or needs anymore, right? It doesn't. It is actually does not. It seems to not be concerned about its image, its reputation. It's actually paving the way for a blueprint, or a kind of program or platform for other states to do the same as it's doing, right? So it's no longer managing a kind of reputational damage in a global liberal order. It's actually saying, hey, the global order is now what we are doing, and here's how you can do it, right? And so we're seeing in the States, like the ways in which people are being interrogated and deported and put into detention centers at the airports, is very much so what Israel has been doing for a long time, right? Anyway, so I think there's also the two books speak to a particular historical period during which liberalism was the aspired ethos, and now we're in a different world.
That's very interesting. So I think we're done. Thank you so much for this interview. I think you said so much interesting things and so much amazing things, although are about bad things that happens. But it was so much interesting, and thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hopefully meeting in Brazil next year when The Right to Name comes out in Portuguese.
Yeah, that would be great. And thank you both. I am really grateful for this meeting.